Hello, Symposiast. I'm Dr. Angela Puca, Religious Studies PhD and University Lecturer, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. Today we are talking about perennialism or universalism versus constructivism. Is the experience of religiosity, mysticism, the gods, the divine, is it something that is universal or is it contextual? Does the context matter? Or regardless of whether you're working with one deity or another, the experience, the mystical experience of the divine is actually the same. We're going to discuss this matter from a philosophical point of view. So I hope that you stick around until the end because I definitely want to know what you think about it. And before we dive into the topic, I have to remind you, doing a bit of symposium keeping, that this project only exists thanks to you and your generosity. So if you have the means, I would love it if you decided to support my project on PayPal, joining my fantastic and ever-growing Patreon community. Also, you can super thank me in the comments. You can check out my services and my online courses at drangelapuca.com. And yeah, you find all the links in bio, the info box, the cards, everywhere. So thank you so much for considering. And don't forget to sign up for my newsletter. That's a free way to stay in contact with me and knowing everything that is going on about me in my life and so on. And it's not reliant on social media algorithms. And I feel a bit more free to express what I want because there are restrictions on every platform. So thank you all. And now let's dive into the topic. So let's try and frame the problem first. So when we ask whether there is such a thing as a universal human experience of the divine, we are in fact asking a set of layered questions about epistemology, phenomenology, and also the politics of interpretation. And it is tempting to phrase the problem in simple opposition. On the one side, a perennialist conviction that the divine manifests in ways irreducible to history, and on the other hand, the constructivist insistence that every utterance about the divine is marked through and through by culture, language, and power. Yet, as soon as one sketches the line of this debate, the contours blur. For example, with William James's famous appeal to the noetic quality of mystical experience in the variety of religious experience, this was not a neutral description, but a turn of the century Protestant inflected psychology of religion. The language of ineffability, passivity, and transcendence that he valorized reflected both the intellectual climate of New England um, pragmatism and also his own therapeutic concerns. Already then, what what was claimed as universal bore the stamp of particularity. Mircea Eliade's patterns in comparative religion extended this logic of universality into the structural language of hierophany. Wherever the sacred appears, it does so through archetypal forms that disclose a trans-historical order. The sacred mountain, the axis mundi, the eternal return, such motifs were presented as evidence for a perennial grammar of the sacred. And yet, Eliade's own position in mid 20th century Romania, his entanglements with nationalist ideologies, and his later exile in the United States suggest that the universalism he articulated was not outside history but emerged from it. As Jonathan Smith reminded us, comparison is never innocent. Universality is itself a strategy, a mode of managing difference by rendering it legible to the scholar's own categories. By contrast, Steven Katz's constructivist intervention in mysticism and philosophical analysis from 1978 sought to dismantle the very possibility of unmediated experience. There are no pure experiences, he insisted. Mystical consciousness, no less than ordinary perception, is theory laden. To say that a Christian contemplative perceives union with Christ, or that a Hindu yogi perceives Atman merging with Brahman, is to recognize that the categories of their respective traditions condition not only the interpretation, but the very phenomenality of the experience. The divine, if such a term is to retain any meaning here, cannot be accessed in its raw form. It is always already apprehended through the greed of culture. Talal Asad sharpened this point by embedding it within the analysis of power. In Genealogies of Religion, Asad critiqued the liberal assumption that religion is a universal essence, capable of appearing in every society under different guises. For Assad, such claims were genealogically linked to colonial discourses, where the positing of universality served as a precondition for Western comparative frameworks, and thus for the governance of non-Western traditions. So the perennialist fantasy of a shared mystical core in this reading, in the reading of Assad, cannot be detached from histories of domination, translation, and epistemic violence. The problem we must frame then is not simply whether human beings share a universal religious capacity, but how the very categories of universal and particular are mobilized within the study of religion. What is at stake is not only ontology means what is real, the study of what is real, but also the politics of knowledge. Who has the authority to speak of the divine? Under what conceptual apparatus? And with what consequences for those whose practices are rendered as data for universalizing claims? It may be more fruitful to see the universal and the particular less as opposed positions than as rhetorical operations, each functioning within a scholarly field to secure a certain vision of religion's nature. The challenge, therefore, is to attend to the moment when an appeal to universality masks perhaps a parochial claim, and when the assertion of particularity risks dissolving the possibility of cross cultural intelligibility altogether. Now, let's look at the historical genealogies of this debate. So, if we follow the genealogy of this debate into the mid 20th century, we find that the question of universality and particularity became less a matter of theological affirmation than of methodological necessity. Stacy's Mysticism and Philosophy from 1960 remains a paradigmatic case. Stace was a philosopher trained in the analytic tradition, and his typology of introvertive and extrovertive mystical experiences was meant to cut through the vagaries of comparative religion by offering a phenomenological core. The introvertive was characterized by a sense of undifferentiated unity, an absence of content, and a collapse of subject object distinctions. The extrovertive, by contrast, retained multiplicity but disclosed it as an underlying unity. His clarification, presented with clarity of logical analysis, was seductive precisely because it suggested that mystical testimonies could be mapped, sorted, and compared with scientific rigor. Yet, Stacy's universalism was haunted by its own philosophical genealogy. His descriptions resonate strongly with Advaita Vedanta categories and with certain strands of Christian negative theology, but far less with the ritualized ecstasies of Afro-Brazilian candomblé or the embodied possession states of Central African spirit cults. What counts as mystical in his system is already the distilled product of traditions valorizing interiority, ascetic discipline, and the suspension of language. To use Jonathan Smith's acerbic formulation, Stace had defined himself into a corner by assuming that whatever did not fit his definition was not really mystical. The scholar of Sanskrit Fritz Stahl offered a rather different challenge to universalism. In his controversial essay, The Meaninglessness of Ritual, from 1979, Stahl argued that ritual actions are formal systems governed by rules but not reducible to semantic or symbolic content. By shifting the focus from meaning to structure, Stahl implicitly undercut the perennialist search for experiential essences. With perennialism, there's the search of the one true essence that underlies all the differences. So, if ritual efficacy derives not from a shared experience of the sacred that is universal, but from patterned, often opaque repetitions, then what unites religious traditions is not some interior common core, but the sheer human propensity to generate formalized sequences of action. Stahl's intervention, while often caricatured, pointed the debate away from inner states and towards the outer performance, the embodiment, and rule governed practice. From a different angle, Ninian Smart's The Religious Experience of Mankind from 1969 represents an attempt to mediate between these positions. Smart was committed to the comparative project, yet he eschewed the stronger claims of perennialists by insisting on a polythetic approach. Religions cannot be reduced to a single essence, but exhibit family resemblances across multiple dimensions. Ritual, myth, experience, doctrine, ethics, social forms, material culture. In this frame, mystical experience is one dimension among others, not a privileged window into the universal. Smart's contribution is less often discussed in contemporary theory, but his attempt to find a middle ground prefigures later efforts to preserve both the comparability and the situatedness of religious phenomena. By the late 20th century, the perennialist optimism had met with sustained critique from scholars who were attentive not only to language but also to conditions of modernity. Robert Sharp's work on Zen, for instance, dismantled the idea that Satori or Kensho could be taken as pure experiential givens. In his essay Buddhist Modernism and the Rhetoric of Meditative Experience from 1995, he demonstrated that the language of direct experience was itself a product of Meiji era reformulations of Zen in conversation with Western Protestant categories of interiority. Zen masters and also their Western interlocutors jointly produced a discourse in which meditative states were cast as unmediated, precisely in order to align Buddhism with the empiricist epistemologies of modern science. Sharp's point was devastating for perennialist claims. What had been taken as evidence of timeless universality turned out to be historically recent, culturally specific, and strategically modern. Wayne Proudfoot's Religious Experience from 1985 added a parallel philosophical critique. Drawing on the hermeneutics of Wilfrid Sellars and Donald Davidson, Proudfoot argued that experience is never bare but always an attribution, a construal that invokes causal accounts. To describe a vision as an encounter with God is to employ a theological category. The experience is constituted by the interpretation. For Proudfoot, the scholarly task was not to adjunctive whether the divine was really present, but to examine the frameworks that render such claims even intelligible. By the time we reach the work of Donald Weeb, The Politics of Religious Studies in 1999, the debate has shifted again. Weber's concern is with the disciplinary implications of universalist versus constructivist claims. He warned against what he calls the myth of religious experience, arguing that the study of religion has often been compromised by its covert theological commitments. For him, the language of universality smuggles theology into the discipline under the guise of phenomenology. Phenomenology is what studies the experience, the experiential side. And thus, the debate over universality and particularity is not only about mystics and their visions, but also about the identity of religious studies as a secular academic enterprise. Taken together, these figures, Stace, Stahl, Smart, Scharf, Proudfoot, Webb, map a genealogy that complicates any easy opposition between universality and particularity. What appears instead is a series of shifting strategies, typologies that extract putative cores, critiques that reveal their cultural partiality, and disciplinary maneuvers that attempt to secure the comparative project against charges of theology. The perennialist impulse never disappears, but it is increasingly hedged, redefined, or embedded in empirical instruments like Hood's mysticism scale. The constructivist insistence on situatedness, meanwhile, expands into genealogical and political analyses that reframe the very category of experience. Now, by the late 1970s, the perennialist imagination was running up against a very different sensibility, that of constructivism. At its core lay a suspicion of the category of experience itself. And with it, the claim that anything like a universal essence could be distilled from the chaos of religious life. Steven Katz's now canonical formulation in mysticism and philosophical analysis is often rehearsed in shorthand. His dictum that there are no pure experiences, but this dictum also deserves to be heard in its original philosophical register. Katz did not deny that mystics have profound encounters, nor that those encounters feel immediate to the subjects themselves. His point was rather that immediacy is itself a production of mediation. One does not first encounter an undifferentiated divine reality and then interpret it through the lens of tradition. Rather, the categories of the tradition make the encounter what it is. So the tradition makes the encounter possible to begin with because it equips the person, the practitioner, with the categories to even perceive it. Otherwise, they wouldn't even be able to perceive it. And in this sense, experience is not a raw given, but a cultivated achievement, and it is necessarily shaped by language, ritual, and expectation. The stakes of this claim became clearer when refracted through anthropological genealogy. Talal Asad's Genealogies of Religion shifts the register of the argument from epistemology to power. For Asad, the very possibility of positing religion as a transhistorical universal depends on the Christian and post Enlightenment history that produced experience as a privileged category of authenticity. To speak of religious experience as the common substrate across culture is not merely to misrecognize the difference, it is to reproduce the epistemic violence of colonial modernity, in which other life words are folded into categories that first emerged in later Christianity, in later Latin Christianity. When perennialists imagine that they are recovering the same mystical core in a Sufi poet and a Carmelite nun, what they are in fact registering is the reach of their own conceptual apparatus. Assad's provocation is to make scholars accountable for the histories that render universality conceivable in the first place. The anthropologist Saba Mahmoud radicalized this insight by attending to how the subject is shaped not simply by discourse but by embodied practice. In Politics of Piety from 2005, her ethnography of the Egyptian women's mosque movement, um, she mentions that, and she challenged liberal assumptions that agency consists in resistance to norms. For her interlocutors, agency emerged through the cultivation of virtues, modesty, patience, pious comportment. within the discursive and disciplinary structures of Islamic tradition. Now, the divine was not encountered by stepping outside culture into a universal core, but by inhabiting particular forms of bodily practice that constituted both subject and object of experience. The argument cuts against the grain of perennialist universalism by showing that what counts as divine presence is inseparable from historically specific regimes of training, discipline, and desire. If Katz and Asad undermined the epistemological foundations of the Perennialist project, Robert Sharf drove the critique into the very rhetoric of unmediated experience. Because one of the claims of the Perennialist view is that if there is an underlying truth, an underlying unity across different religions, and the experience is unmediated and universal to humankind, one of the part of this argument is the perception of unmediated, because the concept is that if there is perennialism, if there is universalism, and if there is this core one truth that we can all experience and we all can share, then the experience is unmediated. It's not dependent on the culture. It's not depending on the tradition. It's not dependent on the frame. And here we have the sharp challenges that. So in essays such as Buddhist modernism and the rhetoric of meditative experience, Sharf demonstrated that claims to direct, ineffable insight in Zen were not timeless givens, but historically situated strategies. Modern Japanese reformers engaged in dialogue with Western science and Protestant Christianity, redescribed meditative attainment as a matter of immediate inner experience. So, what appeared to perennialists as cross-cultural confirmation of a universal mystical core was in fact a modern reinvention designed to translate Buddhism into the idiom of experiential interiority. The irony is sharp. The very category that promised access to the universal turned out to be the contingent product of cross-cultural entanglement. More recent theoretical interventions have shown how deeply this entanglement reaches into the semiotics of practice. Webkin, in Christian Moderns from 2007, develops the notion of semiotic ideology to explain how certain media are authorized as transparent vehicles of divine presence, while others are dismissed as fetishism or superstition. In Protestant modernities, sincerity and interiority are valorized. Words are seen as conduits of intention. In other traditions, material objects and ritual forms are treated as efficacious in themselves. The point of our purposes is that what counts as divine encounter cannot be abstracted from these semiotic regimes. To imagine a universal substrate beneath them is to miss how the very possibility of encounter is constituted by the social and linguistic ecology. These critiques converge on a common insight. Universality is never found, only posited. The claim that mystics everywhere touch the same ineffable reality turns out to be a function of particular discourses, pedagogies, and power relations. At the same time, constructivist arguments are not without their own risks. If every experience is fully constituted by culture, do we not risk collapsing into a radical relativism where comparison becomes impossible? Katz himself left little space for family resemblance. Assad left us with suspicion but few comparative tools. This is where subsequent attempts to bridge the divide will attempt to recover grounds for comparison without slipping back into essentialism. So, if perennialists imagined mystical consciousness as a spontaneous eruption of the divine, and constructivists dismantled that possibility by underscoring its cultural mediation, ethnographic work has shown how the very capacity to experience is painstakingly trained. The question is not simply whether God, spirits, or cosmic unity are out there, but how people come to recognize certain inner states, bodily sensation, or auditory phenomena as divine. Lerman's When God Talks Back from 2012 provides one of the most detailed accounts of this pedagogy. In her study of American evangelicals, she demonstrated that learning to hear God's voice is less an act of belief than of attentional discipline. Congregants are taught to treat stray thoughts, mental images, or even a sudden memory as potential communications from God. Through repeated practice, often embedded in prayer groups, these fleeting experiences come to feel less like random mental noise and more like an encounter with a person. The striking point is that this process produces a phenomenology of immediacy precisely through sustained training. What appears to the practitioner as an unbidden, direct experience of the divine is from the outside a gradual reconfiguration of cognitive habits and perceptual framing. Birgit Meyer takes this analysis into the realm of aesthetics. Her concept of sensational forms refers to the authorized media, sounds, images, gestures, material artifacts, through which presence becomes perceptible. In Pentecostal Ghana, for example, sermons, film, music, and ritual architecture combine to saturate the senses with cues of divine activity. Here again, the experience of God's nearness is inseparable from the sensory environment. A believer does not simply have the experience and then interpret it through theology. The experience is co constituted by an entire assemblage of practices, technologies, and semiotic ideologies. This intertwining of form and feeling recalls Caroline Humphrey and James Laidlaw's account of ritual as archetypal action from 1994. They argue that rituals are marked by their relative indifference to the intentions of the individual actor. Participation requires one to submit to forms whose efficacy is precisely in their formalism. By repeating prescribed gestures, words, and postures, practitioners are shaped into subjects capable of experiencing certain states. The ritual does not guarantee that what will be felt, but it furnishes a structure in which particular experiences become recognizable and indeed required. Taken together, these studies complicate the binary of universality and particularity. They do not deny that something powerful is felt, but they reveal that the capacity to feel it is not innate and self-evident, but it's cultivated. The divine voice, the sense of awe, the perception of presence, these are not merely given, but learned, stabilized, and sustained through linguistic, ritual, and sensory techniques. One might say that universality, insofar as it exists, lies not in the content of experience, but in the human capacity to be trained into words where the sacred becomes sensible. The perennialist impulse, though battered by constructivist and genealogical critiques, did not disappear. It re-emerged in psychology of religion, where the question of universality could be operationalized through empirical instruments. At the center of this reconfiguration stands Ralph Hood's mysticism scale, developed in the 1970s and refined across decades of cross cultural testing. Hood explicitly modeled his instrument on Stacy's typology of introvertive and extrovertive mysticism that we have discussed earlier. By breaking Stacy's categories into measurable items, statements such as, I have had an experience in which I realized the oneness of myself with all things, Hood sought to test whether people from different religious traditions reported the same experiential structures. Factor analytic studies repeatedly showed that respondents, whether Christian, Hindu, or Muslim, clustered in ways that seem to confirm Stacy's twofold typology. This line of research gave empirical teeth to the perennialist intuition. If Catholics in Spain and Hindus in India endorse the same items with statistical reliability, is this not evidence that a common experiential core exists beneath doctrinal differences? The allure of such findings lies in their quantifiable resistance to the charge of cultural construction. Rather than relying on selective comparison of mystical text, one can point to psychometric data. And yet, here too, the neatness unravels. Critiques note that the mysticism scale presupposes stasis categories. It does not test whether they are valid cross culturally, but rather measures the extent to which respondents conform to them. So, whether they conform or not. As Wayne Proudfoot argued, the very description of an experience is already interpretative. Asking a Hindu respondent whether they felt union with all things does not tap into a neutral, universal essence, but reframes their experience in a Protestant Vedantic idiom. Empirical universality then risks being the artifact of translation. Robert Foreman attempted to sidestep this problem by positing the existence of pure consciousness events. He calls them like PCEs. And in a series of essays and volumes, one from 1990 and one from 1999, he argued that mystics across cultures report moments of contentless awareness, states without sensory input, thought, or even self representation. Unlike Katz, who saw all experience as concept laden, Foreman maintained that such events are phenomenologically empty and therefore evidence of an experiential common ground. This claim is bold and it resonates with reports from yogic samadhi or certain strands of Christian apophatic mysticism. But once again, skeptics note that the very idea of pure consciousness is embedded in specific traditions that valorize silence, negation, and emptiness while neglecting others where ecstasy, possession, embodiment, or vision are central. The psychological turn does not simply replicate the earlier philosophical perennialism, it reframes it within the epistemology of the social sciences. Where James appealed to introspection and Stace to typology, Wood and Foreman invoke scales, factor analysis, and neurophenomenology. Yet the questions remain uncannily similar. Can human beings across cultures touch a stratum of experience unmediated by language? Or do these instruments merely redescribe particular traditions in the idiom of science? The common core hypothesis as a psychological program thus oscillates between its promise of comparability and the suspicion that its universality is methodologically pre inscribed. What is most striking, perhaps, is that the debate itself becomes part of the phenomenon under study. The very act of designing a scale, extracting factors, and comparing across populations is a ritual of secular empiricism, one that enacts the perennialist desire for universality under the conditions of modern science. Just as Eliade projected the archaic onto the comparative screen, so too Hood and Foreman reproduced the perennialist imaginary in the language of psychometrics and consciousness studies. If psychology promised a methodological way back into universality, neuroscience extended that promise into the realm of the brain. In the 1990s, Eugene D'Aquili and Andrew Newberg began developing what they called a neurotheology, promising and proposing that recurrent patterns of neural activation could explain why humans so often describe experiences of unity, transcendence, and ineffability. Their work first articulated in The Mystical Mind from 1999 and in a series of Zygon articles posited that the brain's orientation association area, when deprived of normal sensory input during meditation or ritual, produces a sense of undifferentiated wholeness. The perennial mystical unity could thus be accounted for neurobiologically, not as a metaphysical given, but as a pattern emergent from specific cortical functions. This model is attractive in a way. It offers a physiological substrate for universality, one not reliant on the selection of text or the imposition of typologies. If mystics across cultures report a collapse of boundaries between self and word, perhaps it is because meditation, chanting, and ecstatic ritual down regulate certain neural networks in predictable ways. The universal in this framing is not the divine, but the architecture of the nervous system. If you have seen my video on why science cannot prove magic, you will know why I would argue against this specific claim. But it's important to address all the theories and the different stances on the topic of universality and particularity. So I'm presenting all of them. So, yet neuroscientific attempts at explaining are also riddled with interpretive tensions. Mario Beauregard and Vincent Paquet's study of Carmelite nuns is a case in point. By scanning the brains of nuns as they record moments of union with God, they identified distinct neural correlates associated with memory, emotion, and self referential processing. But what precisely does one infer from such findings? Neural correlates do not adjudicate between theological and reductivist or reductionist interpretations. They may show that intense prayer activates limbic and attentional systems, but they cannot demonstrate whether the nun was in contact with God or merely relieving a subjective state. As Anne Taves has argued, neuroscientific data describe mechanisms, not meanings. The leap from neural activity to the real presence of the divine is always an interpretive one. Moreover, the data themselves are often thinner than the rhetoric suggests. Many of these studies rely on recall rather than real-time mystical absorption, since the latter is nearly impossible to replicate in a laboratory setting. The reported states are filtered through memory, narration, and compliance with experimental design. The sense of immediacy, so treasured by perennialists, is here doubtly mediated, first by tradition and training, then by fMRI protocols and scientific expectations. There is also the question of whose brains are being scanned. The majority of such studies focus on contemplatives drawn from traditions that valorize stillness, silence, and interiority. Carmelite nuns, Tibetan monks, long term meditators. Possession rituals in Afro Caribbean religions, trance in Brazilian Umbanda, or spirit journeys among Siberian shamans rarely make it into the scanner. The neuroscientific universal is thus shaped by the selection of subjects who fit a certain contemplative mold. What looks like universality may in fact be a culturally and methodologically narrowed slice of human religiosity. Nevertheless, neuroscience has enriched the debate by showing that certain embodied techniques, chanting, rhythmic movement, breath control, sensory deprivation, reliably produce alterations in attention and self perception. Whether one interprets these as theophanies, illusions, or neurophenomenological shifts, the data demonstrate that religious experience is not free floating, but deeply tied to the capacities of human bodies and brains. If perennialism once looked for the sacred outside history, neuroscience invites us to look for it inside physiology. Yet the perennialists hope that here, at last, lies the universal essence of the divine, remains as contested as ever. So, to conclude, the question of whether there is a universal human experience of the divine or whether such experiences are always culturally mediated is not a problem to be solved once and for all, but a horizon against which our scholarship unfolds. And even as practitioners, pondering these questions. The perennialist dream of an irreducible core, whether articulated in James's noetic quality, Eliade's hierophany, or Hood's psychometric scales, has provided a language of comparability that resist the parochialism of purely local accounts. Yet the constructivist and genealogical critiques remind us that the very act of identifying a core is itself a cultural move, often one that privileges traditions of interiority, silence, and transcendence at the expense of the noisy, messy, ecstatic, embodied, and political forms of religiosity um, elsewhere, that are found elsewhere. Consider the Zen monastery. Victor Horace's analysis of Rinzai training shows that the sudden flash of Kensho, so often invoked by perennialists as the paradigmatic instance of universal awakening, is in fact cultivated through years of pedagogy, ritualized interaction, and tightly scripted koan practice. The language of immediacy is not false, but it is taught. The ineffable is made legible through form. Here, the perennialist claim to a universal mystical core is undercut by the evident historicity of the experience, even as the recurring phenomenology of breakthrough continues to tempt comparison. Or take Tamil Bhakti traditions, where devotion manifests not in silence but in possession, in the trembling of the body under the god's descent. Anand Pandyan documents how such experiences are embedded in caste hierarchies, gendered expectations, and moral cultivation. The divine is encountered, but always in ways that reaffirm or sometimes destabilize social structures. The perennialist abstraction of union falters here. What is felt is not a generalized unity, but a concrete God whose presence reconfigures social relations. Yet at the same time, the intensity of possession, the overwhelming sense of otherness within, resonates uncannily with testimonies from vastly different contexts. Pentecostal deliverance in Ghana offers a further pressure point. Birgit Meyer's long term work shows how media, film, sound system, ritual architecture are not secondary but constitutive of presence. The felt nearness of the Holy Spirit is mediated through technological assemblages that amplify and orchestrate sensation. To speak of a universal experience of the divine risks missing the way these encounters are inseparable from global circuits of media and capital. And yet, the testimonies of believers, conviction or release, echo with experiences reported in monastic and yogic contexts, albeit through different idioms and infrastructures. Finally, consider the hesychast prayer of the Orthodox East, where monks repeat the Jesus prayer in synchrony with breath and heartbeat, training attention to rest in the prayer of the heart. Accounts of union with divine light, as in Gregory Palamas' 14th century writings, resemble inform what perennialists would identify as the mystical core. But the tradition itself insists on vigilance against plani, deception by false visions, and roots authority in communal discernment. The experience cannot be detached from doctrinal battles, ecclesial politics, and the bodily disciplines of monastic life. Here again, the universal is inextricably coming from the particular. These cases demonstrate that the perennialist and constructivist poles each capture something but never the whole. Perennialists intuit that there are recurrent shapes to human encounters with the divine, unity or conviction, the sense of being overtaken. Constructivists remind us that these shapes are carved within particular histories, languages, and disciplines. The real challenge for practitioners who are interested in the debate and religious studies is not to decide once and for all between them, but to inhabit the tension, to acknowledge that experiences are always trained and mediated, yet that these mediations yield recognizable patterns across radically different life worlds. Perhaps the universality is not in the content of experience, but in the human capacity to be shaped through ritual, language, media, and discipline into subjects who find themselves overwhelmed by something they name as divine. And perhaps the particularity is not an obstacle to comparison, but the very condition under which comparison becomes meaningful. To press the debate beyond stalemate, then, is to hold universality and particularity together as analytical partners, each necessary to illuminate how humans encounter, narrate, and contest the presence of the sacred in their midst. Thank you very much for your attention. These are the references. So, this is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for sticking up until this point. I am so proud of you. You are very committed to your learning. That's fantastic. And leave me a glasses emojis if you watched until this point. You know, the glasses as in for, I don't know, scientists. Even though I'm an academic, I don't wear glasses, but that's the trope. So let's go with the trope emoji wise. So, thank you for sticking up until this point. I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. Let me know in the comments what you think about it and share the video around. Also, don't forget to smash the like button if you like this episode. And yeah, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and activate the notification bell so that you get always notified. I hope again that you will consider supporting my work on PayPal, Patreon, Coffee, YouTube memberships, super thanking me in the comments and checking out all the services that I offer on my website, drangelapuka.com. And thank you all so much for being here. I really hope that you stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now.
Today